If His Spirit lives in you, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead will give life to you. It's difficult to get up here and preach to a largely empty room. I'm thankful for the 7 or 8 faces I'm looking at. And can't see all the ones at home. But I want you to know, if you have prayer request, we want to respond. That's why I have this up here. You can respond. I'm kind of looking at what you are saying. And so please feel free to do that. And that way we can kind of have a feel for what's going on in your life. I don't normally, as some of you know why I'm here in a suit, I don't normally wear a suit, but I do on Easter. If I was going to a wedding, if I was going to a funeral, if I was going to a special dinner in honor of someone, I would be dressed in a suit because it is a special day. And so I've just always kind of done it on Easter because this is our special day where we recognize something very, very important. And the other reason is, I hope maybe you'll notice the tie and not look at my head. This is now about week 7 or 8 without a haircut. And so now for about the last, couple weeks, I've been trying to do it myself in the mirror. And this week we're out in the backyard and my wife was helping. And so I have no idea whether anything above the neck is even working anymore. And so these new little trials that we're facing that we haven't faced before. On Easter Sunday, I would like to do something a little different and go to Paul in the book of Romans chapter 8. Some of you have heard me say that if I had to throw away every book in the Bible except for one, my book I'd have would be Romans. And if I had to throw away every section of the Bible but one, my section would be Romans 5 through 8. And if you had to have one chapter, my chapter would be Romans 8. It is easily the most theologically dense and meaningful chapter in the Bible. There's been a lot of interesting things we've had to do this week that's not normally part of my week. Some of you have known there's this paycheck provision program, or I'd probably not get the second P right, I can't remember, by the federal government where we're able to take advantage of, and there's been a lot of paperwork ready and applications filled out and get it sent in, so there's all this federal paperwork that's not part of my normal week. It's a program that's supposed to kind of stand in the gap in any downturn and at some point in the future potentially pay it back unless we do certain things, and then we don't have to pay it back, so we thought we'd take advantage of that. And I want to thank all of you for your continued support and giving to the church. If you continue to do that through this downturn in any way, we have lots of different options. We're going to emerge from this better than we were before. So please stay faithful. We need a lot of new in our lives, especially now. The sheltering in place was old last week. It's really, really old this week. There's other things we did. We took a bunch of eggs to our son and daughter-in-law's house where our granddaughter is, and we hid them in the backyard. And then stood and watched as she looked for Easter eggs in the backyard. A one-person Easter egg hunt. And Grandma and Grandpa stayed at least 10 feet away from everybody at all times. That's hard when you have a granddaughter because you don't want to stay away from a granddaughter. You want to pick her up, you want to hug her, you want to do all that. We didn't. This is really getting old. The isolation is really getting old. This has been an intensive week of hanging out with the spouse. My wife says that's getting really, really old. We long for normalcy now more than ever. We would like to get back to something resembling some kind of normal, and I get it. this wasn't on anybody's radar screen. I'm reading out of Romans chapter 8, starting with verse 10. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of His Spirit who lives in you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it is not to the flesh to live according to it. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. I've thought a lot about how much this week has mimicked in many ways that week of the first Easter. Even wrote about it this week. Imagine you're one of His disciples and this person you had followed, you have just seen him die on a Roman cross. And I don't think we can understand how that would have felt. Because in many ways, we live in a country that, I'm not talking about morally, I'm not talking about that kind of comparison, but in the relative power they had in the world, we're living in something that's fairly close to Rome right now, most of us. They were completely powerless. They had no vote, they had no influence. Rome had all the power in the world. They had just started to follow a leader that they thought maybe was the Messiah, and they had all these preconceived notions of what that meant. He was going to overthrow Rome. He was going to set up a new kingdom. This was when everything was going to be made right. And then they saw the power of the day nail Jesus to a cross. And while they watched that happen, one by one, all of them denied knowing Him. And they ran in the other direction. And now, maybe out of shame, maybe out of fear that Rome might now look for them, they were living in isolation. They were living this quiet existence. They were hiding. They were sheltered in place. I think about the Jews of the time. They had spent most of their existence trying to live according to this law. They loved the law. Everything they did was about following all the precepts of the law. And they had failed again and again and again. And they knew they had failed. They knew they'd failed for a simple reason. Rome was in charge. If they had lived rightly, if they had lived correctly, Rome would not be in charge. And they found themselves once again under Rome. And they wanted freedom. I would like some freedom again in some areas of life. There are some states that now have made it illegal to garden. Don't ask me why. There are people itching to do some former ways of life. They had just spent the last weeks collaborating with their hated enemy, Rome, just so they can kill this Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah. Imagine their enemy, the one who was holding them down under her thumb, Rome, and they had just spent a week collaborating with Rome for the singular purpose of putting down someone who was not leading a rebellion or a violent resistance or anything of the sort. In some macro setting, things looked very bleak for them. But the Gentiles weren't any better. They had had century after century after century of worshiping idols. And now, a lot of those Gentiles were all united together in this world power named Rome. And now, their chief power and his representative, Pontius Pilate, had just put to death this person named Jesus. What I want us to see is every power on earth had collaborated together and somehow centered all their anger, centered all their resistance on this one person in a bleak backwater. It's almost like everything in the whole entire world would seize up together just to go after some person without much means in Idaho. And I'm not talking about Boise, I'm talking about a little town. The disciples were isolated, the Jews were isolated, the Gentiles were isolated, everyone was isolated. And it was difficult. Our lives have been difficult. If you ask me what's the thing I'm going to do first when all this stuff gets lifted, the answer is easy. I'm going to go to my granddaughter's house and I'm going to give her a hug. We now live at a time when we understand their plight in a way maybe we haven't before. We live in a culture and a time that glorifies freedom and freedom of movement. Most of us here, if not all of us, are from the Midwest. And we are used to open spaces. We can go where we want and travel in any direction without mountains or oceans restricting us. If we go east, we got to take a little detour south to go that way. But anyway, but we're used to that. We're used to seeing far off in any direction. I remember those years when I was living in exile in East Texas. And there was one year where we were coming home and we were coming up 57. And you get to southern Illinois and it's really hilly. And we get to around Effingham. And Effingham, everything flattens out. And all of a sudden I was on this flat farmland. And I had this almost emotional reaction of feeling like I was home. It just looked right. But see, now we're restricted. We cannot go wherever and we cannot do the things we've normally done. If this time has shown us one thing, I hope it's shown us this. We really do need each other. And I think we're really starting to need that interaction again. I've read people write things. Well, what's going to change after this is all over? Well, people won't hug anymore because they'll be afraid of the pandemic. And if that's the case, we will have lost something intensely important. These weeks should prove to all of us that we're geared for interaction, we're geared for relationships, and this is all getting so old. We need a new dose of the new again. We need to feel regular life again. We need to feel new life. I know this was predictable. I've already seen in the last month alcohol consumption's way up. Drug use is way up. Domestic abuse calls are way up. Overdoses are up. Are you ready? Saw this yesterday. Over the same period a year ago, heart attacks have increased by 5 times over a year ago. Isolation is hitting us hard. Stress is hitting us hard. All our attention's over here. We're forgetting about some other parts of life that are very, very important. And we need hope and we need life today more than we ever have. That's why I picked this verse in Romans. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available for you. So today I proclaim a fantastic story, an improbable story, probably a little bit of a crazy story. Jesus was dead and now he's alive. I know that that's not a very scientific thought. I know that there's a whole lot of people who have a very mechanistic, deterministic view of the world, says that that's impossible. This is where Christianity has lost touch with reality. But I proclaim to you this seemingly impossibility, that Jesus is alive. It's hard to imagine history coming out like it has without that little claim being true. How does 12 people eventually overthrow a Roman Empire? How do all these people with so many better messiahs coming along decide to attach their name, attach their fate, attach their lives to this one? And Rome says, if you don't stop, we'll kill you. And they went, oh, well, okay. I'm not sure it's that fantastic. Just this week, my wife and I were taking a walk. We have a little trail by our house, and it goes between this creek and this lake for about, 200 yards or so. And just in the last week, all the turtles have now emerged. And any place there's a little log or a stick that sticks up out of the water, if the sun's out, the turtles will climb up there and sun themselves. And my wife asked me a question. She says, hey, what happens to the turtles in the winter? And I wanted to jump in with an answer real quick. That's what I think. I envision myself as the answer guy. I said, well, let me tell you. I don't know. I have no idea what happens to the turtles in the winter. So you know what I did? I looked it up this week. Turtles will shelter in underneath the ice. And then you go, wait a minute, what do they breathe? Are you ready for this? Turtles don't breathe in the winter. They can exist for weeks and months without oxygen. I did not know that. Really, if there's something that can do that, is the resurrection that preposterous? Is something, a caterpillar that goes into a cocoon and emerges a butterfly, is the resurrection that preposterous? Does a bear who hibernates for 8 months, is it really that preposterous? If we want to believe that all of life is only determined by these very mechanical considerations, I'm not sure we understand life. There's more to life than just a mechanical formula about everything. I said to open up, even if no one ever believes that Jesus rose from the dead, something changed that day. Later on in Romans chapter 8, Paul has a much bolder statement. He says the whole cosmos changes. Some of us have lived and remembered times in the 60s and 70s when the air was so thick, smog was literally invented. And in many places, that problem's gone away. There were waterways that were too filthy to even hold life, and now it's teeming with life. Listen to this verse. This verse might be the most powerful verse in all of Scripture. If Christ is in you, then the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you. He who raised Christ from the dead will give life to you. Boy, that's an audacious claim. What does that mean? Well, first of all, let me tell you what it doesn't mean. And I know you can turn on someone later tonight who'll tell you this, but oh well. When you are sick, you'll automatically be healed if you have enough faith. No. If you have enough faith, you can go right up to someone with the coronavirus, have them cough in your face, and you'll be fine. No. One of the reasons why we are watching this online is we don't want to have someone here unknowingly have it and then have 20 people get sick. This idea that no struggle will ever come my way, no. The one who raised Jesus from the dead had to raise Jesus from the dead because trouble came his way. And Paul's way, and David's way, and Abraham's way, and Peter's way. Our promise is simply this. Maybe three things. First one is this. Death will not be the final verdict for us. That's wonderful news. We've seen people react out of fear in these last weeks. It's fine to have caution. It's good to live responsibly. I hope we're not living in fear. Our promise is this, a life that's more abundant than the life we had before. We really don't live. Genesis is chapter 2, gets it right. We don't really live until God breathes His life into us. Greed, anger, bitterness, coldness of heart drain life from us. We need new life. We also have a strength and a peace if we yield our lives to God. This is the day we celebrate new life. We need new life today. We need a little bit of hope. I know there's a lot of promises out there. I know there's a lot of people out there that seek notoriety, and often they'll use faith, they'll even use religion as an avenue, as a vehicle to gain that notoriety. They'll promise wealth, they'll promise ease, they'll promise comfort, they'll promise a quick healing from everything you might possibly get. Even on Easter, we are not spared from the difficulties that life sometimes brings. But Easter makes another offer to us. Easter offers us the same new life that Jesus had. If His Spirit lives in you, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead will give life to you. Life. That sounds good. I wrote earlier in the week, some of you might have gotten it, some of you might not have. This first Easter was experienced in little groups of 2 and 3. And you'd hear the news and share it with someone else. In many ways, that's how we're hearing Easter this year. In groups of 2 or 3, or maybe groups of 1. You're watching on a computer instead of all together. I'm so glad you are. I offer you and I proclaim to you in your little groups of 2 and 3, I'm sharing with you this news that people shared with the first Christians, the first believers, that first Easter. I'm sharing to you around your computer, Jesus is alive. And that life makes a difference. It doesn't make it easy, but it makes a difference. And if you're a little tired of all the sheltering in place, I hope it gives you a little bit of hope as well. Easter offers us new life. Jesus said, I've come that you may have life and have it to the full. He also said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Easter offers us His presence. The presence of a living God, not a historical date on a calendar, who has experienced everything that we do and everything that we will, including death. And because of that, we get to experience everything that He did, including resurrection. So Easter offers us hope. Our current isolation will not last. All of our isolations are doomed. Because I offer you the news today, He is risen.